really honored to introduce Dr. Isaac Sasson as a guest speaker at the PRC Friday Seminar, which is held in collaboration with the Center on Aging and Population Sciences. Dr. Isaac Sasson is an associate professor of sociology and head of the Means Demography Lab at the Tel Aviv University. He received his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and was a postdoctoral fellow in population health at the London School of Economics. His research on social inequalities has appeared in leading journals, including Science, Demography, and Social Science and Medicine. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Isaac Sasson to present today's talk. Social inequalities in bereavement across the life course. A study of fourth-generation kinship networks in Sweden.
Thank you very much for attending. It's an honor to be here. We were just talking about this yesterday. It's almost a decade since I graduated from UT. It's been really a trip down memory lane, walking in this campus again. It's been a really fantastic period in my life, and I'm happy to be back. It's a bit nicer to be in a familiar environment. And thanks again for Deb and the center for inviting me to give this talk. Okay, so this is a new project that we've started, me and my collaborators, which I will mention in a minute, looking at social inequalities in bereavement or in family bereavement across the life course. And we started with the Swedish case study for various reasons that I will talk about later, but mostly because we have terrific data coming out of this particular country. We're using registry data. So we're covering the entire population. And there's 8 countries or 8.5 countries in the world that have centralized population registers. Sweden is one of them. So this study is really unique in the way that, in the sense that we cannot replicate it in many other countries, but of course, we can come closer in some countries. And ideally, I would like to continue this in the US and other places as well. But this is sort of a proof of concept to start a conversation around the question of inequalities in bereavement, which has already been started by Deb and a lot of other people, including here at Texas. And this work is in collaboration with Linus Andersson from Stockholm University, who has been really instrumental in the methodology and using the register data, and with Alison van Walpe and Diego Alvarez Gutierrez from the Max Planck Institute. So this is joint work. And we started thinking about this quite a few years ago. And we've been really thinking about, the background is well known to everyone in this room, I hope. We know that social inequalities and mortality have really increased in pretty much every high-income, low-mortality countries we've been looking at. Some more than others, but it's basically happening everywhere, including some of the most egalitarian welfare states like Sweden and Finland and so on. And this is in spite of the tremendous rise in human longevity. And this is sort of the story of Lincoln Phelan, fundamental cause, and so on, theory, and so on. But surprisingly few studies have looked at the impact of mortality inequalities on inequalities in family bereavement. We've started seeing that in the last decade, and especially in the last 5 years. But this link has sort of been, this potential relationship has been overlooked by demographers for a long time. And this project is our first attempt to try to sort of reverse the gaze, the sociological gaze on mortality inequalities from outcomes of social inequality to causes of social inequality. So to think about how do inequalities in bereavement in the end lead up to differences in perceptions, risk expectations, risk perceptions, and behavior, differences in behavior. And this work is founded upon 3 theoretical pillars. One of them is going back to classic demographic transition theory, thinking about macro-micro relations. And I think there's a very fundamental question in demography that has not really been given a lot of thought empirically. And this is, how do demographic rates translate into the lived experience? In this case, we're looking at bereavement, but this is a very big question that has been there in demographic transition theory from the get-go. So if you think about a replacement strategy and insurance strategies and so on, it's already implicit there. If you think about this classic example or explanation of why fertility, the global fertility went down, is because mortality went down. And once people learn that, socially learn, or learn to expect that mortality will go down, then maybe they adjust their fertility. So this is a story we've all heard in sort of demography 101, but it's surprisingly been rarely tested empirically. And if it has been, it's been tested in the context of development. We've seen that a lot in sort of low-income countries, not so much in high-income countries. So part of my argument here is that maybe we should start looking at mortality inequalities, so this link between mortality inequalities and bereavement, also in high-income countries, given the increasing inequalities we find in mortality. So I'll talk a bit more about that. The second pillar is trying our first attempt at sort of bringing together kinship demography and the literature on mortality inequalities, which again, I think we're definitely not the first to do this, but I think this is something that has not been pursued enough in demography. So I'll say a few things about that. And the last pillar is life force theory, which really informs our conceptualization of bereavement as a multifaceted phenomenon. So this is a quote I really like by Richard Wilkinson in his book Unhealthy Societies from the 90s. And he says, perhaps the easiest way of seeing intuitively what the socioeconomic differences in death rates mean is to imagine two people, each with a similar sized circle of friends and relations, but living in separate rich and poor areas. For every death that occurs among the circle of friends of the person in the rich area, the person in the poor area will know of 2, 3, or even 4 times as many deaths among his or her circle of friends. And this is a very nice way to think about sort of going from the macro to the micro. So what is the lived experience of mortality inequalities? Now, this is, of course, a stylized example, because in reality doesn't really, sort itself out in such a neat way. So people are not segregated into, not entirely segregated into rich and poor areas. Or, you can think about other social determinants. But it's not far from the truth to find basically mortality rates are 2, 3 times, even 4 times higher among one group in society compared to another. And again, this goes back to this fundamental question: how do inequalities in mortality, or how do mortality environments or mortality regimes become inscribed in our cognitive schema? How do we learn about demographic reality? It's a very seminal paper by James Montgomery. How do we basically become aware of our demographic reality? And of course, most people don't read statistical bulletins, so they learn this from their immediate social ties and relationships. This I'm not going to spend too much time on, because I'm sure everyone in this room knows this, but income and education gradients in mortality have really widened in the last several decades. We find mortality inequalities irrespective of which dimension of SES we use to measure them, by income, education, occupational grade, and so on. And we know that they have independent effects of somewhat independent effects of one another, because even when you control for one, the others still appear. And we find this even true to be true even in Sweden and in other very relatively very egalitarian countries. We've shown this in some of my own work with collaborators in Finland and so on, in Sweden as well. And these inequalities have been increasing in those countries too. And as we know from Dev's work and several other people, we also know that this to some extent has bearing on inequalities in family bereavement. So Dev's seminal paper in PNAS in 2017 found that African American children are 3 times more likely to lose a parent by the age of 10. She has had more recent work with Rachel Danelli, looking at different ages as well, and the prospects of, or not prospects, but the risk of losing a family member and the consequences of that. And there's been other work, which I will mention a bit maybe in the next slide or so. But we've seen sort of the beginnings of trying to think about how the two might be related. Now, I would like to make the case today that kinship demography really matters for understanding this process for several reasons. First of all, going back again to the demographic transition theory, in the last 1 or 2 centuries, depending on which part of the world you're looking at, demographic transitions have really changed kinship structure. So the rendered family is more vertically dominated. We now have multiple generations living concurrently, as opposed to horizontally dominated kinship networks, where you have more siblings, cousins, nephews, and so on. There's a really fantastic paper by Sasson and Rob Mayer from a few years ago in demography that they looked at exposure to grandparents or grandparents exposure to grandchildren. And at the turn of the 20th century, the average American could expect to live concurrently with any grandchild for 5 years. By the end of the 20th century, you know what that figure was? It was over 30 years. This is the really fundamental change in the family. That is driven, of course, by a lot of demographic processes. Some of them are related to mortality, but also to fertility. It depends on how early we have kids, or how late, of course, and how early or late they have their own children, and so on. But these are really important changes that we haven't really looked at very carefully. Another issue is that kin structure also varies by SES. So the story is complicated even further. So it's not just about the fact that there are inequalities in mortality, but also the kinship itself varies. And here I'm sad to say that we know a lot less about how it varies. There's been a lot of research, of course, in family demography, but it's less consistent than mortality inequalities. So we know that we've seen in many countries, including Sweden, some reversals, for example, in fertility gradients. So for example, in Sweden, low-educated women are actually more likely to remain childless now compared to a few decades ago. And often these measures are based on period estimates, so it's hard to draw any conclusions for cohorts. But we know that these exist, of course, and we need to think about SES patterning kinship as well. And there's been, I kind of divide this into two camps or two maybe approaches to studying family bereavement. One approach has to sort of this camp. Hal Caswell, Ashton Verderi, and others have taken sort of a formal demography route where they use formal demographic models and simulations to look at differences between groups. And basically, what is your expected time with a grandchild, or how many family members you're expected to lose by a certain age, and so on. It's really fantastic literature, but the main issue here is that they rely on central demographic rates. They don't look at actual data, or they use group averages, basically. And the other camp, and this is a lot of Deb's work belongs in this camp, also Jason Fletcher and other people, have looked at, these are empirical studies, often survey-based, but they often look at the dyadic relationship. So what is the risk of losing a parent, or a parent losing a child, or losing a spouse or a partner, and so on. And our attempt with this study is to sort of combine these two approaches and basically use empirical data, but look at the entire universe of family bereavement with actual data. So we're reconstructing 4-generation kinship structures or networks in Sweden. And just to illustrate why this really matters, to think about kinship and mortality inequalities together when we think about bereavement, just with a simple example. Here, we know that educational attainment is associated with both lower mortality, but also later childbearing. So if you compare two children of the same age, the child whose father is more educated has lower mortality on average, lower risk of mortality. But that father is also on average older if we fix the child's age. And then the net effect of these processes is not so clear. Okay, so the dad is, in this case, it's an example, the dad is older, but also if the parents, if the dads or the fathers are the same age, of course, the more educated one will have lower mortality. And of course, when you aggregate this to the population, it's not so clear in which direction this effect would go. And we can think in this, at least in this scenario, these two factors could offset one another, but that may not be the case in all societies, in all historical periods, and so on, and for all relationships. And the last bit, we'll soon get to the actual data and results. The last theoretical pillar is life course theory. And here we're basically relying on, so like I said earlier, of course, the loss of a family member is a very stressful life event. It's always been, it's the same today. But our expectation of losing family members and the different points in our lives have really changed because of differences in mortality, but also differences or changes to kinship structures. And the sociology of death and dying and bereavement over the last 3 or 4 decades have told us basically that this risk is related to class, gender, ethnicity, race, but it also, the impact really depends on the timing in which we lose a member of the family during the life course. Do we lose a parent during childhood? Do we lose a parent later in life, and so on? And there's some literature, again, going back to the 90s by Linda George and others, that also taught us to consider on-time and off-time deaths. This idea that it's not just about when, but it's also, is this death anticipated? And it could be a partner who's, even at old age, who died unexpectedly, but it could also be losing a child or losing a sibling or something like that, which in our current demographic environment is very much unexpected. It's not always been the case, of course. If you go, for example, for Jewish mourning rituals, basically for centuries, the norm was that you do not mourn a child who died in the first month of their life. And of course, this stems from the expectation that a lot of infants will die. So you do not sit Shiva, and you don't do the mourning rituals and so on. So of course, it has to do a lot with the expectation. Losing a child today is one of the worst tragedies that we can imagine. And again, not that it was not the case back then, but it was just more socially anticipated. So we're trying to factor all of these sort of lessons or insights from life course theory into our conceptualization of the burden of bereavement, which is sort of a concept I would like to suggest. So to sum all of this up, this is sort of our snapshot of our theoretical framework. In blue, we have sort of the macro level part, and we have the social determinants. And today we're going to focus on class, but you can think, of course, on you can think about ethnicity and race and gender and so on. But we think of the social determinants, which basically tend to shape both kin structure and mortality environments. And then the green part is the individual level. So we're jumping from the macro to the micro. And all of these together shape the burden of bereavement, the experience of bereavement by individuals. And we break it down, this experience, into 3 components, as I mentioned in the previous slide. We're looking at intensity, so the cumulative number of deaths in the extended family a person has gone through by age, so over the life course. The timing in which these deaths occur, from the perspective of ego, and the predictability, or we're thinking here again about this idea of off-time deaths, and we're measuring this very sort of crudely in this study, but we're thinking about mostly deaths that occur outside of the expected generational ordering. So losing a child or losing a sibling early in life. Of course, we could complicate this and think about causes of death and so on, but we didn't have the data for this in this study, but you can think of different ways to operationalize this. The last bit in the shaded green that I'm not going to talk about today, but this is where ideally we would like to take this project further. Once we have a good sort of grasp of what is the burden of bereavement, how does it look in actual populations, we try to link that as an explanatory variable to outcomes, perceptions, expectations, behaviors, outcomes, thinking, does exposure to excess mortality in your family, of course, through the different mechanisms that we can think about, does it change the way people behave, people think, people make adjustments in their own lives and so on. We're cheating a bit here because we've done some of this work in a different study. So we looked at only at that part, but not in Sweden. So they're not really connected, but we also, from my own research and from other people as well, we know that, of course, there is to some extent an effect, for example, losing a spouse or a parent on expected or subjective survival expectations. So you ask people how long they expect to live in the HRS, for example, or in other surveys, and we know that they tend to update their assessment if they lose a family member. So ideally, we would like to sort of connect that, but that's sort of a future extension. Okay, I will say a few things about the Swedish context, and I'm sure that not everyone is familiar. Sweden is, famously egalitarian, and that's true. It has lower levels of income inequality compared to most other countries, although it's been increasing in the last several decades. So it's better than others, but it's definitely not perfect. And as a result, we've also seen increasing SES gradients in mortality, especially in the last 3 decades. But again, whether you measure it by income, education, and so on. We also know that Sweden is a low fertility country. So basically fertility is below replacement level. But in the European context, it's actually been very high until recently. So only basically since COVID, it's gone down more. It was actually very close to 1.9, the TFR, until just a few years ago. But still, I mean, this kind of, we have in mind how big families are if we look at this particular cohort. Cohabitation is very common. It's actually the modal union form for this cohort that we're gonna study here. So we need to think about not just marriage, but also cohabitation. We know that in Sweden, family complexity has increased over time, and for this birth cohort especially, we have complex families, we have multi-partner fertility, and so on. In most surveys, we don't have that information, but here, because we're using registry data, we're able to map all of these relationships and connect them to ego. So this is really a one-of-a-kind study, at least I think so. That gets us really a very deep insight into these kind of complex family relationships. And the last thing, like I mentioned earlier, there's been a reversal of social gradients in childbearing, but it's unclear in which direction it goes for this particular birth cohort and so on. So we don't have a strong hypothesis on how it would affect socioeconomic differences in bereavement. So the data I mentioned already, we have the Swedish population registry. These are individual level records of all Swedes residing in the country since 1960. Of course, we actually have many of them who were born before, but we have a snapshot from 1960 and onward. We continue following them. And we're focusing in the 1973 birth cohort, which was sort of a compromise, because if we go backward in time, we lose some of the ability to basically link their grandparents. And if we go forward in time, we have better linkage to the grandparents, but they didn't have enough time to have children. So we're kind of finding, for this proof of concept, we're like looking at this middle cohort, and but we could do this for other cohorts. We're just losing some of these ties. And the data are pretty good. We have over 99% linkage with parents, and above 90% with grandparents. But importantly, it doesn't seem to vary much by SES. So this is actually very important, that it doesn't seem like linkage is dependent on our explanatory variables, the main explanatory variables. The methods are quite simple, because this is not a sample, it's not a survey. We just enumerate all of the social ties by relationship, and then just see when they have died. And we do this by age, by ego's age. Then we enumerate the number of deaths that each person in this cohort from birth in 1973 all the way to 2020, which is the end of the follow-up period. So there are 47, and we follow basically all the kin or all the basically family members who died by relationship type. Then we do the same thing, but we break it down by the socioeconomic status of ego. So this is very important. It's a proxy that we know that mortality environments and SES are correlated within families, but of course it's not a perfect correlation. But for this just simple first study, we're looking only at ego's SES. We're doing it by education, by income. Educational attainment categories, we use roughly, this is comparable to less than high school, some college, and over. We also do it by income quartiles. The results are pretty similar. They're somewhat attenuated when you look at quartiles compared to absolute levels of education, but the overall patterns and trends are quite similar. And then we estimate the probability of kid death by relationship, by age X of ego, and we break it down by generation. What is the probability of losing a sibling or parent and so on by a certain age? Okay, and the last bit of the method, then I'll go to the results, is that we use standard decomposition. Only here we kind of tweak it, and we use, so this is the kin bereavement rate, and we look at the difference, the socioeconomic differences in kin bereavement, and we kind of decompose it into 2 components. Sort of the component on your left is the part attributed to differences in kin age structure, and the part on the right, the term on the right, is basically inequalities or differences attributed to differences in kin mortality. So we're trying to tease out, to separate how much of the difference in bereavement rate is due to in mortality inequalities and how much due to just differences in kin age structure. So this is for the complete population. Again, very simple figure, but it took, as you can imagine, a lot of work to get there. This is, again, Linus Andersson's work, who's been very good at this. He's been working with registry data for a long time. Not so much with mortality inequalities. I think that was why the collaboration was so fruitful. But we really were able to produce this figure, which gives us a glimpse into the universe of bereavement, family bereavement for this particular cohort, from birth to age 47. So of course, as they get older, they are exposed, there's a cumulative number of deaths, so they are exposed to more deaths. By age 47, an average Swede from this birth cohort experienced almost 6 deaths in the family. And we see the breakdown. 3.5 of these deaths on average have been grandparents. Another 2 deaths have been parents, aunts, uncles, in-laws. You can see the differences. So this is like aunts and uncles, mothers, fathers, in-laws. And the remainder is basically contemporaries and children. It's very, as you can imagine, Sweden is a very low mortality country, especially infant mortality. There's not a lot of deaths going on in the younger ages, but there are some, you see here in purple, the loss of cousins and siblings and half siblings and so on. So this is just the universe of bereavement for this particular birth cohort. Okay. Then we break it down by SES, and I'm going to show you the figures for income, for education. I also have the income. They're similar, so we can get back to this in the Q&A. But just to give you a clue of what it looks like. So this is the difference between the low and the high education categories. And if it's above the 0 line, it means there's more deaths in the low education category, and below the 0 line, more deaths in the tertiary education group. The red curve is the net effect. So this is the net difference between these 2 groups. And you can see that, so on average, the low education Swedes from this cohort experienced, by age 47, 1 additional death. Doesn't sound like much. Maybe, of course, every person is a world in himself, but it doesn't sound like a big difference if you think about the total with the average of 6 deaths. But we notice that these deaths are mostly more significant deaths or unexpected deaths. So we look at a lot of them are parents or aunts and uncles, some in-laws, and maybe a quarter of this has to do with contemporary siblings, cousins, and so on. If anything, the high SES group experiences slightly more deaths of grandparents. We'll get to that maybe later on. But there is a difference. It doesn't look like a big difference, but I want you to remember that we're talking about the 1973 birth cohort in Sweden. This is one of the most privileged birth cohorts in the history of humanity. They were born at a time of political stability in Europe, at a time of the expansion of the welfare state in Sweden. It's a very low mortality country. Inequalities for this cohort have been relatively low. Socioeconomic inequalities are increasing now. But even there, in this sort of fantastic population, we still find differences. But then we wanted to break it down so not just look at the numbers, the average numbers, but look at the timing. So here we look at, again, you can generate this for any age, but just as an example, we look at what is the probability of losing a grandparent by the age of 18. These are odds ratios, high education to low education. It's about the same, not much of a difference between losing a grandparent by age 18. But if we look at death in parental generation, this is not just parents, it's parents, aunts, uncles. We see a gradient. So these are odds ratios. Basically, if you look at the low education and the high education, it's about the odds ratio about 1.5 to 2 higher. Again, at age 47, we're looking at grandparents. Not much of a difference, not statistically significant. But if you look at the parental death by age 47, still we find the same gradient. So there is a gradient in bereavement. And it seems like that it makes a difference in terms of timing, because they're more likely to lose, low SES groups are more likely to lose a parent or an aunt or an uncle in childhood. And then we looked at the final part, which was to what extent are these deaths predictable? And again, we're using a very crude measure, but we're looking at death in contemporary generation and descendants. And again, we find the same gradient, very clear gradient, roughly the same magnitude too. And we find the same gradient in death of a contemporary kin. So we're talking about siblings, cousins, and so on, half siblings, by age 18, and the same is true for age 47. And we find this in death of descendants by age 47 as well. Okay, just for completeness, we need to remember that some deaths occur before birth. So before ego is born, maybe the grandparent died or an aunt or an uncle died or so on, which of course is not experienced directly by the sort of ego, but we need to factor for these because first of all, they lower the risk, because if you have fewer grandparents, then you're going to experience fewer deaths throughout your life course. And we can also think, or not in this, we don't do it in this study, we could also think, does it have an impact on the family more generally? Because losing a sibling or losing someone in the family, even before you're born, does it impact the family in a certain way that disadvantages you? Again, we don't really quite have that data here, but this is something to consider. We don't find, again, much going on with the grandparents, but death of parental generation, again, the same gradient, and contemporary as well. So these are deaths in the family that occur before the birth of ego. Okay, the final piece of result or finding that I will show you is the decomposition. Now here we decompose, it's a bit tricky to think about it. We're not decomposing the actual number, this is the decomposition of the rate of bereavement. So every year, what is your the rate in which you are expected to experience deaths in the family? And we break it down to the effect of kin age structure and to the effect of kin mortality. And if it's above the 0 line, it means that it's higher in the low SES group. And if it's below, it means that it's higher in the high SES group. So this shows us that almost invariably across the board at all ages, mortality inequalities really favor the high SES group. This component is higher among the low SES group. You can also see, it's a bit tricky to see, but this is like decomposing it also by the kin age. So like we can see the children and then the young adults, and as you go up the age, so you can see this is broken down by age, but you can see the kin age. And we can see that almost entirely these are disfavoring the low SES group. But we find almost the exact opposite when we look at the age structure, the age composition. Like I mentioned earlier, this could have an effect, and it does have an effect. So it actually, this one favors the low SES group, or this favors the high SES group, because their kin tend to be older. And when you combine these two, you get basically what we saw earlier, that there's a slight disadvantage to the low SES group in total. But this is really a story about, so if we only look at mortality inequalities, we would miss out on this part. And this means that like if these two groups had the same kin age composition, then inequalities would have been a lot higher. And of course, this is specific to this particular cohort in this particular country. We don't know what it would look like in other societies, in other examples. Okay, so just to wrap up, on average, like I said, Swedes from this cohort experienced almost 6 deaths in the extended family by age 47, 3.5 grandparents, 2 parents, aunts, uncles, and in-laws. The rest are contemporaries or descendants. By age 47, low-educated individuals experienced, on average, 1 additional kin death. Compared to the highly educated, it's about half death if you look at income quartiles, the upper quartile compared to the lower quartile. And we basically find a clear SES gradient in the risk of losing a parent, sibling, cousin, and so on during childhood, adulthood, and before birth. Not so much happening with the grandparents. Maybe we can talk about this later. So what do we make of it? Like I said, this is the first study of this project. We're just trying to characterize the universe of bereavement and see whether it differs across social groups. And we find that it does in very interesting ways. So first of all, there is a clear SES gradient across multiple facets of bereavement. We find that SES differences in timing and predictability may be more important than differences in cumulative number of deaths, because the cumulative number of deaths is dominated by grandparents. And there's not much differences between, not significant differences in the risk of losing a parent and the cumulative number of grandparents, the cumulative number of grandparents lost throughout the life course. But then if we break it down by relationship, we see that there is quite a disadvantage. And at least in this particular society, it has to do mostly with the parents' generation and somewhat with the contemporary generation. The impact of mortality inequalities in family bereavement is offset to a large extent by socioeconomic differences in kinship, as we've seen in the decomposition. And then I think like trying to take this further, again, we haven't done this in this study. It's a bit of a data issue because now I'll talk about the limitations in a minute, but this is registered data. So we don't have a lot of information about actual outcomes. It's administrative data, we have to remember that. But ideally, we would tie this eventually to some sort of exposure to, some sort of data set that will allow us to look at outcomes, risk perceptions, expectations, behaviors, and so on. And then thinking forward, could inequalities in bereavement have an explanatory power in themselves in shaping people's outcomes over the life course? And I think Deb's work has really looked into that more carefully than we have so far. But I think we need to merge these two together, these two approaches, because here we're getting sort of a full overview of the universe of bereavement, but we don't have those outcomes that Deb has been looking into from survey data, which is more limited in this other way. There are some limitations to this study. So first of all, like I mentioned, this is administrative data. We only observe nominal kin relations that are available. So we have no information about the quality of the relationships or other meaningful social ties. And again, going back to Deb's work, it really matters. The quality of relationships matters. Also, we don't know whether they live together, children with their parents and so, or with siblings and half siblings and so on. What is the actual exposure? How meaningful are these ties in their lives? We don't know any of that because we're using administrative data. So again, it's very good, but it's not perfect. It's not the gold standard as some people make it to be. We also assume that kin mortality environments are correlated. And we look at EGO's SES. This creates some issues. You can think about, there's reverse causality, or, we basically measure the SES at age 30, so education and income at age 30. We kind of take a 3-year window to kind of get rid of the noise that some people are having if your income decreases or increases, so temporarily. So we take this 3-year window around age 30, but still we're conditioning an adult SES. And we know that sociologically, theoretically, if you think about this process, of course, they're related. If you lost a parent in your childhood, that affects your SES or in adult life, potentially. So this is something we're not too concerned in this particular study because we're just trying to describe the universe of bereavement, to just say, is this something a phenomenon worth looking into? But we could do the same thing with family or adult or, with parental SES as well. Like think of family origin. But this is certainly something to consider if we're not making any strong causal claims here. And like I said earlier, Sweden is characterized by low mortality, relatively moderate levels of intergenerational mobility, and relatively small socioeconomic gradient in mortality compared to the US, of course. But these are factors that would shape this pattern that we're seeing here. And if we look at different societies and different times, they may differ. And for example, here like I said, we're looking at SES. You can ask yourself to what extent are mortality or mortality environments really correlated within a family. And we know that, depending on intergenerational mobility, this really varies between countries. Actually, intergenerational mobility is relatively high in Sweden. But you can think of other societies where it's lower, so this correlation would be stronger. So this implied effect of mortality environments would be stronger, so maybe the differences in bereavement will also be more pronounced. If we look at, we haven't done it here, but if we look at, for this, it's a very homogeneous cohort, sort of predating a lot of the migration waves to Europe. So if you think about ethnicity, it's a much more rigid social structure than class. Then if we think about mortality environments within the family, where you don't have high rates of intermarriage, for example. So of course the effects will be more pronounced. But again, these are empirical questions that we want to ask. So the next steps, like I said, this is just an example. We can use other cohorts and compare. Did this get worse or better over time, or with across successive birth cohorts, really? What is the effect of mortality inequalities, which increased over time? The variation in kinship structure, which changed, but not so clear in which direction. and maybe explore the role of intergenerational mobility. So again, Sweden has fairly high mobility. The US has lower mobility, and other countries even lower. It will be interesting to see what this looks like in those settings. And like I said, the final goal would be to look at the burden of bereavement as an explanatory variable. But this is something really starting to see just in the last few years, and I really hope we'll learn more about that. So again, acknowledging my collaborators, Linus Andersson, Alison von Ralte, and Diego Alvarez Gutierrez, who have been very instrumental in kind of putting this together. And I thank you very much for listening.
We'll let the first two questions come from Brad.
Yeah.
I have a question. At the time, you said that recently the fertility gradient has sort of reversed from like historically the gradient over education level. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
But at this time, like less educated people were still having like more like higher fertility, right?
I'm not sure because we tend to look at this from period perspective, and I don't really know. Actually, if you look at I don't have it here, but we have a table breaking down the actual size of the kinship structure by relationship type. I don't think there was a big difference in terms of number of children with this particular cohort, but of course this will change over time or across cohorts.
Sure.
But yeah.
I was curious about whether like just the size of the kinship network was leading to this higher number of observed.
Yes, exactly. It was, but it's not so much with the children. It was actually has to do with, if I remember correctly, with aunts and uncles.
Okay.
So they have a few more of those in the sort of in the lowest CS group. But of course, with parents and grandparents, there's no big differences because we're using administrative data, so they're all there. And we even look before the birth if they died before. So, but yeah, this is a very important comment, and I think there are differences in size as well, which impact some of it. Yeah.
Cool.
Competition.
I'll ask another one, I guess.
There we
Is there, so, you said that there's not, like, with the administrative data set that you have, the registry data, you have income and education level at age 30, but do you have that over the entire life course? Could you look at?
We do from I think from the 1980s roughly we start having this type of data like income tax.
Sure.
So from that we derive basically. It's not reported. It's actually from government. We just link it based on the ID numbers, and we start getting those around the mid 80s. But we're looking at the age 30 for the scores. For them, we have for all of them. We have it.
Yeah.
We go back in time. Of course, we couldn't have it for everyone. So what was the question?
I guess I was curious if like you know, that seems maybe this is like outside the scope of your interest here, but it just seems like maybe after bereavement events, like changes in the trajectory between changes in the education trajectory or like income trajectory compared to like what you'd expect counterfactually of not seeing that bereavement.
Yeah, I think that there certainly could be. I mean, I think there's been some research on that. And if you think of this as a shock, and of course there would be a bigger effect if you lose a parent when you're a child compared to if you lose a parent when you're an adult, or losing a grandparent, which may not have a big effect on these families, on these individuals. So I'm certain that there could be, there probably is. But like I said, we haven't really looked at it from, we're kind of trying to take a big picture and perspective in this study, or at least the first paper, just think of what is really happening. And then after, maybe we can ask those questions and go like a bit deeper into like, okay, like I said, it's not really a causal argument here, but when if you look at parental SES, maybe it becomes more causal. And then if you look at sort of what the timing in the life course that sort of you experience certain loss, how would that affect your trajectory? You could also look at, income, family, some measure the family income or aggregate income throughout the life course. I mean, you can think about it in very complex ways, and we should. But I think we're just kind of starting to get this off the ground and say, maybe this is something worth looking at. And not, before we ask those additional questions that are very interesting.
Okay, so I'm thinking US family structure
Mhm.
and the number of potential repartnerships in generation 2, generation 3. A lot of people have 6, 8 grandparents that they have a connection to, so the odds of them losing one are much higher than if I only have 2 or 4 grandparents, right? So because of my parents' divorce, they remarried, I felt close to these, but now I feel close to these
Yes.
2. So now I have whatever, and my grandparents divorced, and I like both of those. The
Mhm.
person who has 20 grandparents could experience the death of 10 of them.
Yes.
And that's, and they're close to all of them. And so there's a difference there that I was curious about. And I'll just add in my second question at the same time, which is that there's a percentage which is, you go with that one, and then I'll come back with my second.
No, you're perfectly right. I
And
mean,
you do a great talk. I should have started with that. Love
thank
it.
you. You're perfectly right. And we have looked at some of these relationships, like I said, we look at half siblings and so on. And then it's a question, because we don't know about how meaningful these relationships are. I mean, if you remarry and you have another set of grandparents and so on, or your parents remarry, and you have it's very tricky to think sociologically about these, when they happen in the life course, and whether, so if your parent remarried at an older age, like,
Yeah.
do you really spend time with these people, or it's hard to say, and we don't have, again, it's administrative this, we don't have a good answer to that. But hypothetically, we can look at a lot of these relationships, and we looked at some of them here, but you're perfectly right, yeah. And I think, again, I should have had the table here, but we have a descriptive table, breaking it down by the number of kin, and there are definitely differences in some of those that are driven probably by sort of these complex families that are created increasingly for this cohort, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I
And
think,
it's actually SES pattern, but it's a pattern by SES. Exactly.
and I think some of what my question, if I were to continue as I'm thinking about it, is that if I have all of these grandparents, is each loss, because I really loved them, this happened in childhood, my mother and my father remarried, they were all just wonderful grandparents. Is each loss mean that it's even more, or does it somehow get diluted? Because I still have 6 grandparents who send me birthday cards or whatever, and I don't know, but that's kind of going through my head.
Mhm.
And the other thing I was thinking about, because I was thinking about family structures you were talking, is that by SES, at least in the US, the odds of your having an involved father can get to, so you were saying they're younger, but the odds that they're involved, so maybe I've already lost them, or maybe I never knew them, or maybe so I was thinking about that as well, I don't know, I'm just talking. So what are your thoughts?
No, I mean, again, we've been thinking about this stuff because these are complicated questions, and we don't have good measures of the quality of the relationships. Maybe we can get some measure of like whether they live in the same household, just based on the address.
Yeah.
But even there, I mean, it's really tricky to kind of think about sort of whether they're absent or they're present or not. And I guess this is actually a limitation of using like administrative data. People think that, oh, you have registered data, it's perfect world and you solved everything, but no.
No, yeah, I
It's
didn't.
limited.
I
No, I know.
was curious,
Yeah,
like, okay, if I had
Um,
my ideal data, here's what I think it would show, like, I guess I'm asking you theoretically what you.
Yeah, I
know
would think
and how
about
you
exposure
thought about it.
basically, we're interested in exposure to relationships.
Right,
So this is the main mechanism we're thinking here. And I was talking to Deb earlier, it's not so clear. I mean, you can think of this in sort of prospective approach where you're like, so for example, if you lose a grandparent when you're young, just a
Yeah.
child, what is the loss here? Is it a loss of someone you never got to meet? So you're looking at sort of life years lost together. Or are you really losing someone you knew and loved for a long time? And that's a very different effect. So you can look at this I'm not sure, I don't have an answer here, because you can look at this from both perspectives.
yeah,
And that would actually vary by relationships, but of course, losing a parent early in life when you're a child, it has a huge impact on your life.
yeah.
But yeah, and then like you said, there's also a cumulative effect. I mean, that's why I said we're just starting this, but this is now it's the outcome, but ideally we would flip it around and look at, does the cumulative effect, does it bear on any actual outcomes? So, this again, if we lose more family members, and then we look at the synergies and so on. But these are all terrific questions, and I wish I had an answer.
No, and I didn't mean it as a criticism at all. I just meant it, you're such an expert, like, I'm sitting here thinking, but you've thought about it, so that's why I guess I was just asking, but.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect question. I think this is really important to really move forward and think about those issues. Yeah.
This was great. Really, really good. And listening to Karen's comment, I mean, as somebody who did my early work on counting family transitions, and people will go, what do these mean? And I mean, that is an endless question.
Yeah.
Because some people could be exposed more, and is it, so it's getting, I mean, and the problem of counting, and does everyone mean the same thing? So you will never give anybody a satisfying answer. It's important to think about those things, but it's just one way to kind of imagine the sort of experience of exposure that people experience. So I've loved everything about this. I'm beginning some work now thinking about, and I love this idea of like how bereavement is affecting health behaviors. I mean, I think that's really interesting. I have a paper that looks at having experiences your parents' illness as a child and what that means for how far you go to college. And it turns out if your mother reported feeling bad when you were in middle school, you go to college at qualitatively different levels. And you're also, the effect is strongest for kids whose parents were high SES. So is this, I mean, it could be this sort of amplification, but it could introduce inequalities in different kinds of ways. So just, I mean, I'm not really asking a question, but just, I'm very interested in all of these ideas. And I think there's a lot going on here that we're getting at this sort of shock and disruption, and the causal order is very hard.
It is very hard, exactly. And I really love this comment because we're still trying to grapple with this because it works in ways that are not always immediately intuitive. And, when we started this part, it was like, okay, mortality inequalities, more bereavement. That was kind of our reasoning, or initial hypothesis. But it turned out to be a bit more tricky, and also for different types of relationships. And I think you're perfectly right, because if you think about the expectation, what does it mean to lose a parent if you're high SES, but it's maybe less expected with it, or lose a family member and so on. And I mean, you look at a lot of studies now looking at other countries, and they don't look at family, but you look at like violence in Mexico. Because Manuel Aburto had really fantastic studies on that. That it's so prevalent now. And if you look not with family, but you think that if you're 20, how many people around you have you lost or you know that have died? And how does that affect your sort of your narrative or your entire thinking about the future? I mean, these are the questions we would like to get at eventually. And this is just the first step. But yeah, these are perfectly good comments. Yeah.
This is a great proof of concept. Thank you so much. I keep thinking about the future and scenarios, right? I mean, you've done so much work on things like the rise of midlife mortality. So, to run a scenario where you're seeing the rise of midlife mortality among some of these, especially among the less educated groups, you've seen historical changes, you've documented historical changes too, in terms of trends, some low education groups are actually losing life expectancy. So, I'm wondering at some point, this is like a perfect setup for some sort of microsimulation world in which you're looking at the kinds of the implications of these changing demographic rates, right? And I just mentioned mortality. We possibly have the changes in fertility. And at some point, you'll leave in neutrality, right? Or divorce, or things like that. So, it's like this is a first step, but it is an interesting world where we have these intersecting processes.
Exactly. I think Hal Caswell had a series of papers on kinship demography in demographic research in last over 3 years, published 3 or 4 papers about using matrix models to look at exactly what you're suggesting. And I really love those papers, but at the same time, so it's basically saying, let's plug in all those aggregate rates, by age as well. You can look at age-specific fertility and mortality and so on, and then marriage too, and then you can get an outcome. And you can do it for separate groups. But it's a really, it's terrific work. But the only downside the main downside I can think of is that families are heterogeneous. And you miss that when you look at aggregate or simulation.
Exactly.
We know, it depends on, of course, it's an empirical question. If you look at some societies by ethnicity or race, maybe it's sort of, you can get away with ignoring that. If intermarriage is very low. But when you look at societies where it's not low, then it's not a sort of a viable assumption, and especially when you look over time and so on. So so the short answer is yes. I mean, we definitely need to do that kind of work as well. But I also we're trying to push here that we need to look at actual data, because I think that is part of the story. Family heterogeneity. Maybe that's the next part that we need to add. How does family heterogeneity factor into these processes, intergenerational mobility and so on. Yeah, so I mean, this is, I mean, we have like a famous politician in Israel who like, oh, he was a CEO of like one of the big communication companies, had like millions of dollars, you know, when he retired, like he was 50. He always says in interviews, oh, my brother's a taxi driver. Of course, it's an extreme example, but it happens. And then how do you think about these issues? I mean, so this is part of the story that I think we need to introduce into sort of this narrative.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great.
This is so elegant. I love the decomposition and considering the age structure, and I just think that's beautiful. My question is just sort of a giant question for you, just to let you respond to, is you've talked about looking at this in other countries. So in your imagination, what are the sorts of things that you might want to discover or look at by comparing what's going on in different contexts?
Yeah, so this is a great question. I think, so now we just look at over the life cohort, we look at one cohort. So ideally, we would look at successive cohorts and then look at the inequalities, which we know have increased in Sweden too, but also in the US a lot more. So I think we can get at some of these questions in the US as well. That's partly what I plan to do, but not as extensive networks as we find here. But then basically try to say, did the role of mortality inequalities, how did it change over time in terms of the impact on bereavement? And again, initially we thought, okay, it's probably going to be an effect in this direction. But empirically, I still think that's the case, but it's not so clear whether that really is the case because, like I said, kinship structure has also changed, and it kind of works in different directions. So that would be definitely one direction I would like to go. But then also do the other part and look at how changes in kinship have changed this. And I'm not a kinship demographer, or at least I didn't start, and now I'm becoming more of that. But I did mortality inequalities for the last 15 years. So this is basically sort of how I got into this. But we should certainly think about the question about family complexity and so on as well. I mean, this is something we don't know yet. And again, moving away from like dyadic relationships and so on, just start to think about sort of the entire life course, exposure to kin, to ties, to social ties, as it varies over the life course. So these are the things I would like to get into. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Isaac. It was a wonderful thought.